against rampant, systematic
during that
war
year,
crimes
the world has watched
crimes
with
against
horror
humanity
as Russian forces
bombing
have
schools,
engaged in rampant
hospitals, systematic
war
homes,
crimes,
churches,
crimes against humanity,
shooting unarmed men
bombing
and women
schools,
and children in the streets,
hospitals,
going
homes,
house to house, raping
churches,
and torturing those who
shooting
live there.
unarmed men and women and children
Last
in
week
the
brought
streets.
fresh horror as a
Going
video
house to
surfaced
house, raping
online,
and torturing those who
appearing
live
to
there.
show a Russian soldier
Last week,
mercilessly
fresh horror
beheading
as a video
a
surfaced
Ukrainian prisoner
online,
of war, appearing
cutting
to show
his
a
head
Russian
off
soldier
with a knife while he was
mercilessly
still alive.
beheading a Ukrainian
Responding to
prisoner
that
of
video,
war, Ukrainian President
cutting his
Zelensky
head off with a knife
called
while he
on
was still
the world
alive.
to act and to act
Responding
now.
to that video, Ukrainian
President
President
Zelensky
and to
call
all
Ukrainians
the world
fighting to act
for their survival
and to act now
for global peace and freedom.
To President
Let
Zelensky,
me start by saying
to
this.
all Ukrainians
This
fighting
committee stands
for
with
their
you.
survival,
We support
for global peace and freedom.
We are compiling
Let me start
evidence
by saying this.
of war crimes.
This
even
committee
as
stands
the
with
war
you.
unfolds.
We support you.
Yesterday, Senator
We
Graham
are
and I
compiling
met with the
evidence
Prosecutor General
of war
from Ukraine
crimes even as the war
in real
unfolds.
time, in horrid detail. Yesterday, Senator
He is
Graham
compiling
and I met with
evidence
the
of these
Prosecutor
crimes.
General from Ukraine.
And we must not rest
In real time
until
in
the
horrid
perpetrators
detail.
of more than
He is compiling evidence of
77,000
these
war
crimes.
crimes.
And
that
we
have been
must not
documented
rest
to date
until the
in
perpetrators of more than
Izium and beyond are held to
77,000
account.
war crimes.
Before we proceed, I'd
documented
like
to
to
share
share
a video
in
in Bucha
Bucha
to understand
Izium
what
and
the people of
beyond are
Ukraine
held to
have been
account.
enduring since February of last
Before
year.
we proceed, I'd like to share a video, a few minutes, to understand what the people of Ukraine have been enduring since February of last year.
Russian President Putin claims the invasion is going strictly according to plan. Russian President Putin claims the invasion is going strictly according to plan. As Russian airstrikes hit more civilian areas, the fear is the worst is yet to come.
Too gruesome to air.
Russian airstrikes
In this
hit more
series of
civilian
still
areas.
frames,
The
a man
fear
wearing
is the
military
worst is yet to
fatigues
come.
is seen using a knife gruesome to air. In this series of still frames, a man wearing military
before the war
fatigues is
would have
seen
been
using
filled
a
with
knife
children.
to cut off the head
Missiles
of
struck
another
power
man in an
stations and
army
knocked out much of the city's swim park. Before the war,
In the center of that city, 2 months ago, 1,000 civilians.
Power stations and knocked
Today,
out
the
much of the
Associated
city's
Press
electricity.
estimated a Russian missile strike
In the center of
destroyed
that
the theater
city,
2 months
killed
ago,
600
1,000 civilians. Today, the Associated Press estimated a Russian missile strike that destroyed the theater, killed 600 civilians.
Practically there is no any war crime in history that was not and is not practically there is no any war crime in history that was not and is not
These
committed
are
by
crimes
Russians on Ukraine.
against humanity. And there is no doubt. These are crimes against humanity.
Last fall, this committee held a hearing on the importance of defending an American legacy that began with the Nuremberg trials. Last fall, this committee held a hearing on the importance
bringing war
of defending
criminals
an
and
American
perpetrators
legacy
of
that
crimes
began
against humanity
with
to
the
justice.
Nuremberg trials.
Sadly,
in
more recent
1945,
decades, our
bringing
nation
war
has not
criminals
always
lived
lived
up
up
to this
perpetrators
legacy.
of crimes against humanity
As a
to
result
justice.
of glaring gaps in
Sadly,
our own
in more
criminal
recent
law,
decades, our
many
nation
human
has
rights
not always
violators
lived up
have
to this
evaded
legacy.
justice. Some
As a
have
result
even
of glaring
shockingly
gaps in our own
found
criminal
safe
law,
haven on American
many
soil.
human rights violators have
But
evaded
since
justice.
Putin's invasion began,
Some have
lawmakers
even
on both
shockingly
sides of the aisle
found
have
safe
recognized that
haven
Russia's
on American
aggression
soil
is not just against Ukraine,
but since Putin's
but
invasion
against the
began,
entire
lawmakers
free
on
world.
both sides of the aisle
That's why
have
since day
recognized
one
that
of this
aggression
war
is
Congress
not just
has
against
provided
Ukraine,
unwavering
but
support
against the
to
entire
Ukraine.
free world.
Munitions, tanks,
That's why since day
intelligence,
one
and more
of this war,
to support
Congress
the
has
rule of
provided
law.
unwavering
During
support to
President
Ukraine.
Zelensky's historic
Munitions,
visit to Washington
tanks,
in December, the
intelligence,
Senate
and more
passed
to
the
support
Justice for
the
Victims
rule
of
of law.
War Crimes Act.
During
With
President
unanimous
Zelensky's
support.
historic visit to
Thanks
Washington
to this
in
law,
December,
war
the Senate
criminals
passed
have come to our
the
shores
Justice for Victims
from
of
Russia
War
or
Crimes
from
Act
anywhere else
with unanimous
will
support.
no longer find refuge
Thanks
in
to
the
this
United
law,
States.
war criminals
I
who
want to
come
thank
to our
Senators
shores
Grassley,
from
Graham,
Russia or
Coons,
from
and
anywhere
Telles,
else,
and many
will no
others
longer
for joining
find
me in
refuge in the
introducing
United
this
States.
measure. Together, we've sent a clear message to our allies and our adversaries, and many others for joining America will keep the promise we made at Nuremberg. Together, we've sent a clear message to our allies and our adversaries. But our work is far from finished. America will keep the promise. Yesterday, Ranking Member Graham and I hosted a meeting human rights and the rule of law with Prosecutor General Costin. But our work is far from finished. Yesterday, Ranking Member Graham and I hosted a meeting for committee members with Prosecutor General Costin. His team has gathered evidence, painstakingly put the effort together, risking their own lives to exhume bodies from mass graves and sift through the rubble of flattened schools and hospitals. Here in America, we need to do our part to support these investigations and to address any remaining gaps in the law that enable impunity. To that end, we must finally enact a crime against humanity statute. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in closing this gap in the law. Excuse me. And we need to lead our allies in forming a special tribunal to hold Russia's leadership accountable. We must also ensure that the world's preeminent law enforcement agency, the United States Department of Justice, deploys every resource at its disposal to hold Putin and those who enable him accountable. Today, we'll have a chance to hear directly from the Justice Department leadership and learn more about how they're keeping up the pressure on Russia. At this very moment, heroic Ukrainians are risking life and limb to defend the same freedoms and values that America is founded on. In their struggle, we see our own history as well as our highest aspirations: service, sacrifice, selflessness. It's now our turn to live up to those values. With that, I turn to Ranking Member Graham.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have enjoyed bipartisan support since the invasion. I hope that continues. I believe it will. Just sort of an observation. When all this is said and done, if Putin is still standing and is not held accountable for the barbaric invasion of Ukraine under his watch, then you're going to get more of this, not less. If Putin's given a pass, then everything we've talked about since the end of World War II to make sure that never happens again becomes all talk. This is a moment of testing for the international order, is an opportunity for us to reassert who we are and what we believe. In that regard, this committee can lend its voice. We can change our laws, and we can help the Ukrainians in many ways without putting American boots on the ground. So I want to compliment the Department of Justice for taking an aggressive approach to seizing Russian assets in the hands of oligarchs who support Putin and transferring that money to the Ukrainian people. We've been able to accomplish in a bipartisan manner a change in U.S. law. While we're not members of the International Criminal Court, we have made a change to allow U.S. intelligence to be shared with the ICC to help prosecute Russian war criminals in Ukraine. That does not in any way jeopardize our soldiers. It's a very narrow change to the law. And Prosecutor Khan of the ICC said he believes it would be a game changer in his ability to bring justice against Russian war criminals. The Department of Justice has been great. The Department of Defense has been terrible. I have called more than once to try to get an accounting of what's going on with the task force and the White House, and I get the same answer every time. The reservations of the Department of Defense are holding back the transfer of information that would be vital to allowing the ICC to be more aggressive in their prosecutions. If you get nothing else out of this hearing, I am tired of that, and I think there's a bipartisan support for the idea that the law we pass should be honored. I've been a military lawyer for most of my adult life. We have done nothing to jeopardize or put in motion jurisdiction of American troops by ICC, nothing at all. We have made a decision as a nation to help the ICC prosecute one of the most brutal invasions of the 21st century, may I say, in modern history. We also passed a law, Mr. Chairman, to allow a kleptocrats task force to be created, seizing assets from Russian oligarchs, and along with Senator Whitehouse and everybody in the Senate, those proceeds can be transferred to Ukraine to help them stabilize their country. Over $500,000 has been seized as a result of Ms. Monaco and her team's work. A $90 million yacht called the Tango, another one $300 million called Amanda, $100 million in real estate assets, 2 condos in Beverly Hills, 3 luxury properties in New York and D.C., an apartment on Park Avenue in New York City, a $45 million Boeing 737 owned by a Russian energy company, 2 airplanes worth over $400 million owned by Russian oligarchs, $90 million Airbus. The list goes on and on and on. So I want to applaud you. Go after their assets, follow them to the ends of the earth, take their ill-gotten gain, and give it to the long-suffering Ukrainian people. I'll wrap this up very quickly. The hope here is that we can give the Department of Justice and the Ukrainian prosecutor all the assets they need, reasonably need, to keep the front in the courtroom open. We have a front on the battlefield where Ukrainians are fighting and dying for their freedom. I think it is in Americans' interest to make sure that Putin, who is now has an arrest warrant issued by the ICC for his war crimes, that we do not forgive and forget as a nation, and we help the international community. With that, the State Department has been reluctant, dare say I refuse, to designate Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. What more do they have to do to become a terrorist state under U.S. law? Mr. Chairman, the Senate 100-0 urged the Department of State to designate Russia a state sponsor of terrorism under U.S. law. As the offensive begins this spring on the battlefield in Ukraine to evict the Russian invaders, I hope we can find momentum among ourselves here in Washington to label Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, because with that designation, they become even more radioactive. It's just a matter of time till China test us. I think China is very seriously considering providing lethal aid to Russia, and if they do, I would like them to run into the sanctions that would come from helping a state sponsor of terrorism. We have a chance to deter China by designating Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. I want to do that now, sooner rather than later, to avoid the mistakes of the pre-invasion where we sent the wrong signals to the Russians. I don't want to send the wrong signal to the Chinese. I want China to know, under U.S. law, Russia is a state sponsor of terrorism, and you help them at their own peril. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Graham. Today we welcome Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco. Ms. Monaco is the 39th Deputy Attorney General of the United States. As the deputy, she is the department's second-ranking official responsible for overall supervision. After we swear her in, she'll have 5 minutes to provide an opening statement. Then each senator will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. And I urge my colleagues on both sides to focus their questions on the topic of our hearing. Could the witness please stand to be sworn? If you please raise your right hand. Do you affirm the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that she answered in the affirmative. Now, Ms. Monaco, you're invited to proceed with your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Graham, and members of the committee. I am honored to appear before you today to discuss how the Justice Department is working to hold Russia accountable for its brutal and unprovoked invasion in Ukraine. I want to thank the members of the committee for their bipartisan leadership and support of the administration's response to Russian aggression. The Department of Justice welcomes the opportunity to work with the committee on additional authorities, including conferring federal criminal jurisdiction over certain crimes against humanity, increasing the range of assets that we can seize and transfer for the rebuilding of Ukraine, and expanding the department's authority to prosecute acts of torture committed against U.S. nationals abroad. These additional tools will strengthen our response. Before I begin, Mr. Chairman, I want to recognize that today marks the 28 years since the Oklahoma City bombing, 35 years since the deadly siege at Waco, and just earlier this week, we recognized the 10th anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombing. We remember and honor the innocent lives lost, and we also are reminded, when we think about these tragic events, of why each of us swore an oath to protect this country and the freedoms for which it stands. I'm mindful of that oath when I appear before this committee 2 years ago as a nominee. I pledged to protect our national security and uphold the democratic and rule of law values that define us as Americans. Those values and the Justice Department's mission to uphold them are what bring me back before this committee today. For over a year now, Russia has deliberately and unilaterally inflicted horror upon Ukrainians. Its brutal, unprovoked, and unlawful invasion of Ukraine poses a serious threat to global peace and stability. Its forces have targeted and viciously attacked civilians by bombing hospitals and apartment buildings, by committing sexual violence against women, men, and children, including girls who the United Nations estimates could be as young as 4 years old, by carrying out execution-style murders, including of children, and by illegally removing thousands of Ukrainian children to Russia or Russian-occupied territory. The facts, Mr. Chairman, are clear. Russia has committed war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine. We cannot, we will not let war criminals escape accountability for the aggression and atrocities they have committed. The Justice Department has a clear message for those who have committed these crimes and who think they can get away with it. You will face justice. Our long history of holding Nazis and terrorists accountable shows that the women and men of the Justice Department never forget and never give up in the pursuit of justice. I was reminded of this resolve in February when I traveled to Nuremberg, Germany, to visit the courtroom where the United States and allied partners prosecuted Nazi leaders for the atrocities they committed in World War II. Through principled adherence to the rule of law, former Attorney General Robert Jackson and other prosecutors sought justice and accountability on behalf of millions of victims. Today, this Justice Department and our partners around the world are answering history's call. Using every tool at our disposal, we are committed to holding the perpetrators and enablers of these atrocities accountable, no matter how long it takes. We're working closely with our Ukrainian partners, and on Monday, the Attorney General and I met with Ukrainian Prosecutor General Kostin to discuss our work together to investigate Russian aggression and war crimes and to hold accountable all those responsible. Every day since February 24th, 2022, the men and women of the Justice Department have responded to Russian aggression by pursuing accountability for war crimes, striking back against malign cyber activity, and by using every available tool to limit Russia's access to the global financial system and degrade its ability to fuel its war machine. In that time, we have restrained over $500 million, that's $500 million, in assets of Russian oligarchs and others who unlawfully support the Russian regime and evade U.S. economic countermeasures. We've indicted over 30 individuals accused of sanctions evasion, export control violations, money laundering, and other crimes. And we've arrested defendants in over half a dozen countries around the globe. We are grateful for the tools that Congress and this committee in particular has provided to the department to hold Russia accountable. And we look forward to working together to expand those tools, to close loopholes, and to stay one step ahead of those who would try to escape justice. Thank you, and I look forward to the committee's questions.
Thank you very much. In addition to the critical investigations and prosecutions that are ongoing in domestic courts, the International Criminal Court has a key role to play in ensuring accountability. The ICC has already issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin for the war crime of forcibly transferring Ukrainian children into Russia. The court continues to investigate other war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine. Senior administration officials, yourself and the Attorney General, have repeatedly expressed support for the ICC's Ukraine investigation. Congress has made its support clear as well by passing provisions last Congress that Senator Graham alluded to on a bipartisan basis that provide the executive branch with greater flexibility to provide evidence and other forms of support to the court in relation to Ukraine. Yet I understand that the administration still has not provided this assistance because of objections by the Department of Defense. As I hear the reports of Russian soldiers beheading Ukrainian prisoners, raping 4-year-old girls, I am stunned to hear that this is still being debated in Washington. There is simply no debate about the right and moral course of action at this moment. That is why Ranking Member Graham and I led a bipartisan letter to President Biden last month, urging him to be on the right side of history. I ask you this: is the Biden administration and all the departments of this government united in this effort?
Senator, first of all, let me say we are absolutely united in ensuring there is accountability for the atrocities that you've laid out, that this video laid out, and I talked about in my opening statement. There must be accountability for all of those responsible, and we are grateful for the work that this Congress did in passing the law that Ranking Member Graham and you have referenced that provides a narrow ability and a clear ability for the United States to provide assistance to the ICC for investigations of foreign nationals arising from the situation in Ukraine. The discussions about how to use that authority are, as you noted, ongoing, but there is absolute unanimity in ensuring accountability across this government and using all of the tools that we can bring to bear to bring about accountability.
You know that the debate on the United States and its relationship with the International Court has been longstanding and heated and sometimes emotional. That's why we've tried to take steps to say that we can cooperate by providing evidence and support with the ICC without compromising our position as to membership. Do you have any doubt in your mind that we have sufficient legal protection to proceed with cooperating at this level?
I don't, Senator, and this is why we're very grateful for the work we were able to do with you and your staffs in formulating the statute that you've referenced that the Congress passed late last year to provide this cabined, narrow ability for us as a government to provide assistance to the ICC in this limited circumstances where it's of investigations of foreign nationals arising from the situation in Ukraine. And we were grateful to be able to work with you to provide that narrow capability.
So you have established in your answers to these two questions, first, that this administration is bounded and determined to help in any effort to prosecute war crimes against Vladimir Putin, and second, that doing so will not compromise our government or our military or any branch of our government, and can be done under existing law. Is that a fair conclusion?
I think that's a fair conclusion, Senator. I know there's also some historical precedent for our being able to provide assistance to the ICC in very targeted ways with respect to prior proceedings. So, again, I think the statute and the way the Congress approached this, and again, we were grateful to be able to work with the staff on having this ability be cabined in the way that I've described.
Well, I'm going to conclude by asking my colleague if we could join in another effort, perhaps a letter to the Department of Defense specifically and to the President based on what the testimony has brought forth this morning. I now yield to Senator Graham.
Thank you. Just to put a fine point on this, is it DOD? Are they the problem?
Well, Senator, as I indicated, I think the discussions about how to use the authority that Congress has given.
Nope. You're going to answer this question. Is DOD the problem?
I really don't think, Senator, respectfully, it's appropriate for me to comment on internal discussions.
We have a law on the books. I've been told by people who care that the intel is not flowing, as Senator Durbin described, because of the Department of Defense. I think you need to answer that question.
Well, Senator, what I could tell you is I'm aware of longstanding concerns based on prior positions that I've held that the Department of Defense has raised.
I share Senator Durbin's view that we've done this the right way. I understand his historical precedent. We're not jeopardizing any American soldier. Mm-hmm. We're talking about evidence involving foreign nationals in a specific theater of operation. Mm-hmm. Every law we passed has been completely bipartisan. We're 400 and some days into this war, and I'm going to ask you again, is the Department of Defense the holdup?
Senator, I know the Department of Defense has had longstanding concerns about our engagement.
I don't care what their concerns are. They can share them with me. We got a law on the books. Do you feel like you need to follow the law when you're told to do it?
Yes, Senator.
Okay. So we'll take this up with the Department of Defense. Do you believe that China is watching what's happening in Russia and Ukraine?
Yes, Senator, I do.
Okay. There's reports that China may be considering providing lethal aid to Russia. Have you seen those public reports?
I've seen public reports in that regard, Senator.
Don't you think we should do everything we can to deter China from helping Russia with their barbaric invasion of Ukraine?
There is no doubt that rogue nations of the world, including China, are watching and learning from what is going on. And as I laid out in my opening comments, and as both the chairman and you, Mr. Ranking Member, have laid out, what Russia is doing in Ukraine poses a threat to global peace, global stability, precisely because if it goes unchecked, if there is not accountability, there is no deterrent. There will be license for that type of unlawful aggression.
Well,
and we have to make sure that that price is quite steep.
To those of us on this side who object to defunding the police, I think you're right to do so. When you give the streets to the crooks, you're going to get more crime. So I would say that when you allow Putin to get away with rape and murder and pillage, you're going to get more of the same. This is not a territorial dispute between Russia and Ukraine, is it?
I think this is Russia trying to project its power in a brutal way.
Are you aware that Putin has said he would like to reconstruct a former Russian Empire, Soviet Union?
Absolutely, and we
Are
know.
you aware of the fact that the Ukrainians in the mid-'90s gave up 1,700 nuclear weapons as part of an agreement with Russia, the United States, and Great Britain that their sovereignty would be honored if they gave the nukes back to Russia?
Yes, Senator.
Is it fair to say that Putin has torn that agreement up by his actions?
Putin is acting in a lawless way, in violation of anything.
Is it fair to say that if you want people to have less nuclear weapons, you need to honor agreements when they give up the nuclear weapons they possess?
Absolutely. It's what our international order is
based on.
based on.
You agree with me if Ukraine could go back in time, they would keep the nukes?
Can't speculate on that,
Yeah,
Senator.
I think they would. So to those who think the border is broken, I want to fix it. To those who think what happens in Russia doesn't matter, regarding China, you've missed all of World War II. To those who believe that if Putin gets away with this, it won't matter, you're going to get more of it from other people. The ICC has issued an arrest warrant for the president of Russia. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am.
If Interpol would issue a red notice for the arrest of Putin, would we honor it?
Well, Senator, I think that presumes, which I think is a vanishingly slim possibility, that
No, I got
Putin
it, but
would
the
come
point
here.
is, would we consider him a criminal and honor the red notice if issued?
Well, we certainly consider him a criminal, consider him a war criminal. As you know, Senator, that the arrest warrant...
You know what a red notice is?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Do you think it would be justified for Interpol to issue a red notice against Putin?
I think it's certainly justified. I think what it would do is have to go through the process. The ICC, I think, as a practical matter, could ask for Interpol to issue that red notice.
Would you support them asking for it?
I think they're a party to Interpol, and they can use they've got an agreement to use those mechanisms.
And thank you. The kleptocrats task force has done an amazing job. Well done.
Thank you very much, Senator. They've been working very, very hard.
Thanks, Senator Graham. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. Let me pick up where Senator Graham left off. I wholeheartedly endorse his pressure on you to try to sort out within the administration whatever is blocking cooperation with the International Criminal Court needs to be corrected so that the administration is in compliance with the law that Congress passed. To me, it's as simple as that, and the sooner we can get that sorted out, I think the better. With respect to forfeitures, the law that we passed regarding transfers to Ukraine is now starting to flow. You've had at least one transfer from kleptocrats to Ukraine. I appreciate that and commend you on that success. If there is more support that kleptocrats, and particularly the Marshal Service that has to deal with these oligarch assets needs, will you be sure to let us know, particularly the really big shots right here who are appropriators as well? Dealing with a mega yacht is not a simple task, and dealing with assets of the magnitude that we are seizing, and frankly, with a good deal more to be seized, I think, what do we need to do? Question for the record, what do we need to do to step up and support the existing klepto-capture effort? And with specific regard to one matter, administrative forfeiture proceedings against oligarch assets. If you're an American citizen, the Department of Justice can seize an asset of yours in essentially an in rem proceeding, in which it's United States versus shoebox full of $450,000. But that is only up to $500,000, and that authority stops. What we do not have is authority over $500,000 for these foreign oligarchs. So that puts you in the difficult position of having to parse through all of the multiple screens that they've used, the Cypriot bank accounts, the Cayman Islands shell corporations, to try to figure out who owns what. Whereas if you could proceed in rem and just have it be United States versus yacht, mega yacht, that cuts all that crap out, and it reverses the polarity, so it's now the true owner who has to show up and identify themselves. And as you know, and you've done this with botnets and other things like that, the true crooked owner usually does not show up because they would leave the proceedings in handcuffs. So I think you need that authority. Please make sure that the Department of Justice is supporting the bipartisan bill that would give you that authority against these over $500,000 oligarch assets. Are you comfortable with that?
Well, first, Senator, let me thank you for your incredible leadership on this issue and making sure we got the transfer authority that we have now to use to transfer to Ukraine. We absolutely want to work with you on this in rem idea. I think it could help us streamline matters as you suggest.
Well, it's not just an idea. It's how you actually operate right now with respect to American citizens for property under $500,000 in value, correct?
That's exactly right. But one thing I want to make clear, given the oligarchs that we are going after, given the Byzantine financial structures they are able to create, and the shell companies and the holding companies, and
it becomes all the more important, I think, to have this capability.
It does. However, I would say these are folks who are litigating through any means possible. So I think we will see litigation in these types of cases no matter what.
I get it.
And so we need to make sure we are producing a good factual record so we prevail in those proceedings. I've got all the faith in the world in our prosecutors, so we could use more of those resources. Yeah. So that's a plug right there.
A tip, say, from the captain of the boat could give you plenty of predication to proceed. So, well, my time is running out, so let me ask a couple more questions. Sure. Again, given the little time, these will be questions for the record. You are providing existing support to Prosecutor Costin. Is there more that we should be doing to support his criminal prosecution efforts?
Yes, in fact, we are. We just met earlier this week, as I mentioned. We are adding more resources to our work with Prosecutor General Costin. We're adding more FBI resources. We've just added a pledge.
Just keeping track of evidence is a pretty substantial proposition.
Absolutely, and helping prioritize which are going to be the most likely cases to move the most quickly.
So here's the last one I'll ask you. Again, question for the record. Two questions for the record. One, what is the department's position on what an international aggression tribunal should look like? What are you arguing for and why? And second, the Prosecutor General is going to have to deal with massive Ukrainian civil relief. And to accomplish that, I think he believes that he's going to have to set up a 9/11 type fund, that litigating one by one is just impossible. So you have to set up a fund and let people apply to it. The obvious place to fund that fund is with Russia's sovereign funds that we have now frozen. I think it's important for the department to let us on this committee know what you think the avenues are to deploy those sovereign funds to Ukrainian relief, under what terms or through what devices or with what caveats. And if we don't do that, how else does the relief fund for the Ukrainians who've lost their homes, lost their loved ones, for the civil damages that they're entitled to, how else does that get funded? And I've gone over, and I apologize to the chairman, but I appreciate your work and your answer to those questions.
Thank you, Senator.
Those are questions for the record.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Grassley.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. We learn a lot when we follow the money, and we're talking about money today. And I want to start with this fact that Garcia Luna was convicted January the 17th. You know, he worked with the drug cartels in Mexico, and I'm trying to get some information. I'm worried that U.S. funds being misused to enable human rights violations. On February the 22nd, I sent a letter to DEA and FBI requesting documents about their relationships and knowledge of this corrupt Mexican official. When can I expect the documents that I requested from the Justice Department? I did get a letter from Justice confirming receipt of my letter, but we want those discovery files, and we don't have any problems with the defense counsel for Garcia Luna letting us have them. So when may I receive those discovery files?
Senator, I'm not certain about when you'll be able to get those files, but I'm happy to go back and understand what we're doing to respond to that.
Well, you understand it's pretty darn important for us to understand what's going on between the United States and all this money that we gave to the married initiative that we had there. Several $1 million went into it, and obviously he was connected with that $3 3/10 million. But I'll take your good faith effort to get us an answer when we'll get those discovery files. And it doesn't seem to me we should have any problems when we have the defense lawyer saying we can have them. On another matter, the Justice Department can give Ukraine disgorged assets from the Russian criminal files under the December 22 omnibus appropriation bill. In the past, the United States gave funds to foreign partners who supported major criminal cartels. What is the Justice Department doing to ensure that these disgorged funds don't end up in the hands of bad actors like we had with the experience in Mexico under that initiative I just mentioned?
Well, first, we are using, as the chairman said, the authority that the Congress has provided us when we are able to seize and forfeit the assets we get from these oligarchs to transfer them to the benefit of Ukraine. We frankly would like to be able to expand that authority, Senator. Right now, we're leaving a lot of money on the table for the benefit of Ukraine because we only have a limited ability to transfer assets that are attributable to sanctions evasion for a particular executive order. So, for instance, the millions we're seizing and forfeiting because of export control violations, we can't transfer those proceeds to Ukraine. And we would, of course, have, and there's measures for accountability to make sure that those assets that get transferred, and this is a State Department role, to make sure that they are going to the appropriate places in Ukraine that can be used for the benefit of Ukrainians.
Okay, well, what's the process then for providing that information to the State Department? And I assume you'd be willing to provide it to the Congress of the United States. What is that process?
I'm sorry, Senator, the process for ensuring controls on the money that goes to the benefit of Ukraine?
Or if you find that bad actors are receiving the funds?
Well, certainly there's inspectors general who would review that, and also ultimately our own. We have a long history in the Justice Department for investigating and prosecute fraud in government programs and fraud for contractors abroad and the like. So our prosecutors would be looking at that. But I'm happy also to work with colleagues at State Department to get you a more precise answer.
For my last question, and let me go to this, we have a lot of bad actors other than just Russia and Ukraine and the Mexican cartel, so I want to go to another bad actor, Venezuela. In 2009, then Vice President Biden told Russia it's time to press the reset button. Given that we're having our second hearing on Russian war crimes in Ukraine, I think we can all agree that that was a big mistake. Like Russia, the United Nations has accused the acting Venezuela government of crimes against humanity. President Biden has again, quote, unquote, press the reset button and unfrozen $3 billion to Venezuelan assets and allowed Chevron to drill there. Does the Justice Department still consider Nicolas Maduro a fugitive of U.S. justice? And if so, does the Justice Department still committing to pursuing his arrest?
Well, Senator, we're absolutely committed to pursuing justice in cases that we have indicted and brought. The Venezuela example is a very good example for why we need a crimes against humanity statute. Right now, we cannot pursue the type of lawless activity that you've referenced that has gone on in Venezuela, the types of atrocities that have been committed by the Chinese against the Uyghurs. We can't pursue that type of justice here in U.S. courts without a crimes against humanity statute. So that's why in my opening statement, in my statement for the record, I am urging this committee and this Congress to fill the gap that the chairman referenced in giving us that authority.
Okay, so you do still consider Maduro a fugitive of U.S. justice?
Yes, Senator.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. Welcome, Deputy Attorney General Monaco. I think I'll start with something that I'm not certain has been raised, and that is about what's happening to journalists right now. And I think one of the reasons that we know about these Russian atrocities in Ukraine is in large part because of the extensive reporting. Many journalists who have worked to expose Putin's brutality have been killed, as we know, while covering the war, including American journalist Brent Renaud. And now Russia has wrongfully detained Evan Gershkovich of the Wall Street Journal, American reporter. I just saw that horrible vision of him in that glass box last night on the news. Without getting into any specific case, can you speak to the department's efforts to investigate the killing and wrongful detention of journalists by the Russian Federation?
Thank you, Senator. And let me say my heart goes out to the Gershkovich family, and I want to echo Secretary Blinken's call for him to be immediately released. It's outrageous what has happened to him and, of course, to Paul Whelan, who remains unjustly detained by the Russian government. You were quite right, and as the video that the chairman started this hearing with, the only reason we really are able to see the atrocities and the horror that is happening is in large part because of brave journalists who are going into harm's way to document what we are witnessing and are able to witness the horror that is happening. And that's why we are so grateful for our ability to deploy what we have called the War Crimes Accountability Team. This is a group of prosecutors that Attorney General Garland designated last year, led by a seasoned prosecutor and who was built our capability to go after and hunt Nazi war criminals. We're using all of that expertise now to investigate and prosecute the war crimes that are being documented by brave journalists. And the types of cases that we are investigating are exactly what you laid out, Senator. Journalists, U.S. journalists, who come into harm's way and are victims of Russian atrocities on the ground. And unfortunately, we have seen examples of that. So we have active investigations that are moving just as fast as we can possibly move them. And we've got prosecutors and investigators who are working day and night to bring about that accountability.
Okay, very good. Along those same lines, like many of my colleagues, I visited Ukraine right before the war started, and then with Senator Portman last August. And I talked to President Zelensky directly about this. We went to the grave with Senator Portman and I did in Bucha. And I rang true to me when President Zelensky spoke about the importance of holding Russia accountable for its crimes and said, revenge cannot do what justice can do. And to me, that's no more apparent than the detention and forced re-education of Ukrainian kids. Thousands of them have been separated from their families, held in camps where they are vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. Senator Graham and I just introduced a resolution condemning Russia's kidnapping of Ukrainian children. Could you talk about what the Justice Department is doing to ensure that those responsible for the kidnapping and forced re-education, I don't even like to use the word, of Ukrainian children are held accountable for their actions?
I've seen that resolution, Senator, and I commend you for putting it forward. What we are seeing is nothing less than Ukrainian children being disappeared by Russian actors and by the atrocities that Russia is perpetrating. Our investigators and prosecutors are pursuing all avenues of war crimes investigations, including what is happening for the forced removal of children from Ukraine. We are also working with our Ukrainian partners. I mentioned our work with the Prosecutor General. This includes investigating what is happening to children, including the bombing of maternity wards. Is what we've seen, again, documented by brave journalists. So all of our war crimes investigation activities encompasses the atrocities that are being perpetrated by children.
One last question is one of the things we've seen is that the Russian government denies any responsibility for actions in places like Bucha. Instead, they make completely false claims that the bodies and images were planted, that it's fake. How is the Justice Department working to counter Russian disinformation, both as it relates to hampering prosecutorial investigations and to distributing propaganda?
Senator, I put zero stock in what Russian propaganda arms and Russian officials are saying about what's happening in Ukraine, and we are working tirelessly to and meticulously document and gather the evidence that can be put forward in these cases and that can be shared with our Ukrainian and other European partners to bring forward their cases to make sure there's accountability.
Thank you. I think we kind of defied what people would expect in the way that President Zelensky was able to harness social media and the internet to get his people with him and the world with him. And part of that was our ingenuity. I know that. But we just have to, and I know you are doing this, but we have to just continue also the counteroffensive on the internet with what they're doing. That's been the thing that's emerging now. So thank you.
Thanks, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Deputy Monaco, for being here, and thanks for your service. In early March, we had Attorney General Garland before this committee, and I asked him a series of questions about 18 U.S.C. Section 1507, and specifically why no arrests have been made at the homes of Supreme Court justices in violation of that statute, which prohibits people from protesting or demonstrating outside the home of a Supreme Court justice or a judge or a juror or other officer of the court with intent to influence any court proceeding. His answer was succinct, but amounted to the effect that the marshals are on the ground, and the marshals have full authority to arrest under any federal statute, including Section 1507. About 3 weeks later, my friend and colleague from Alabama, Senator Katie Britt, before another committee asked Attorney General Garland about a slide deck that she had discovered that was being used to train the U.S. Marshals who were performing their protective detail duty at the homes of Supreme Court justices. These slides seem to contradict what Attorney General Garland had told me 3 weeks earlier. They contradicted in several respects. First of all, the slide number 4 says that in order to make an arrest there, they really need to be looking at something that demonstrates, quote, the intent of influencing any judge language, thus logically goes to criminal threats and intimidation, not First Amendment protest activities. Now, I personally, as I've poured through that statute, I don't see that as an element of the offense. It's not an element of the offense. There's nothing in there that requires it to have this separate non-specified element within 1507 about the intent being something amounting to criminal threats and intimidation. That's not in there. Just as troubling, maybe even more so, is slide number 5, cited by Senator Britt at that same hearing, where it says that, quote, any contemplated U.S. Marshal Service enforcement action under 1507 should be coordinated in advance with the appropriate U.S. Attorney's Office. And as if that were not enough to discourage the marshals from making arrests under Section 1507 in this circumstance, it goes on to say that it is counterproductive to make probable cause arrests on cases that the U.S. Attorney's Office will not charge and prosecute. So I've been wondering, how exactly is it considered to be the full authority to arrest people under Section 1507, as the Attorney General has described, if you have to get pre-clearance first to do it, and if you're adding an additional element, one not found in the United States Code?
Well, Senator, I know the Attorney General has spoken quite directly to this about the direction that he has given and has repeatedly given to the Marshal Service, and the Marshal Service Director.
When he was asked about these slides, by the way, he was not aware of them. Were you aware of them? Were you aware of them before they were given to the Marshal Service to train marshals on how to protect the homes of Supreme Court justices?
No, Senator, but I also know that the Marshal Service Director has been very clear that he is will regularly review the training provided to the Deputy U.S. Marshals, who continue to this day to provide 24/7 protection for the justices, their homes, their property, at the unprecedented direction of Attorney General Garland last year. This has never happened before in the history of the department.
I understand that, but I'm asking about the enforcement of Section 1507. Now, you're the Deputy Attorney General. Under the organizational chart of the Department of Justice, you have supervisory authority, oversight over the U.S. Marshal Service. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so you're saying you had not seen these slides before the marshals were trained on it?
That's
I assume you've reviewed them since then?
I've seen the slides that you referenced that Senator Britt showed to the Attorney General.
And have you discussed them with Attorney General Garland?
I have not, Senator, but I would like to make very clear the direction the Attorney General gave to the Director of the U.S. Marshal Service, who himself has indicated that he has been told repeatedly by the Attorney General that he has full authority to enforce all federal laws, including 1507, as long as he's prioritizing, and the Deputy U.S. Marshals are prioritizing, the life, the safety, the protection of the property of the justices, which is...
Under any of the other federal statutes under which they're authorized to make an arrest on the ground, have they added an additional non-statutory element to the offense, or have they required pre-clearance with the U.S. Attorney's Office prior to making a probable cause arrest?
Well, Senator, without necessarily adopting your interpretation of the slides, the Director of the Marshal Service has been very clear. He's going to regularly review that training. He's got all the authority repeatedly given to him and directed by the Attorney General to enforce federal law. His priority, however, and that of the Deputy U.S. Marshals who are providing that security and that protection, is for the property, the life, the safety of the justices and their families.
And yet, since this slide was revealed to the public, he hasn't either corrected his statement or gone back to the Marshal Service and asked that the additional non-statutory element be removed, or asked that the pre-clearance from the U.S. Attorney's Office be approved prior to the making of a probable cause arrest under Section 1507.
The statement by the Attorney General was very clear and not in need of correction. He was very clear about the direction that he is given to the Marshal Service.
He had no idea what direction had been given to the Marshal Service. No idea whatsoever. So we can say a lot of things about it. It was not clear, and he hasn't cleared it up, and it's rather inconsistent with what he told us in front of this committee.
Respectfully, Senator, the Attorney General was clear. His direction to the Marshal Service, to the Marshal Service Director, was to prioritize the life, safety, and protection of the property of the justices, to have the full authority to enforce any federal law.
With pre-clearance and with additional elements not found in the statute.
Respectfully, Senator, that was not the Attorney General's testimony. That was not his statement, his direction to the
Well, he wasn't aware
director.
of it. It couldn't be in his statement. He didn't know about it. Not when he talked to me, not when he talked to my colleague, Katie Britt. I see my time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for being here, Deputy Attorney General Monaco. And thank you for the work of the Kleptocapture Task Force and for Attorney General Garland's very clear, unequivocal commitment, as he expressed after signing a memorandum of understanding with Prosecutor General Costin the other day. He was certainly very forceful in his commitment. The Kleptocapture Task Force is pursuant to sanctions that have been imposed according to law. I want to join my colleagues in saying that in a very bipartisan way, we want an all-of-government commitment, including the Department of Defense, whatever obstacles there may be to its participating. I would like you to provide some briefing to us in another setting, if necessary. I understand your reluctance to do it here. Let me ask you, is there any legal obstacle in your view to declaring Russia a state sponsor of terrorism? This body, after the initiative that Senator Graham and I did, voted unanimously in favor of the United States declaring Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. I know the State Department has raised reservations. I don't believe they're legal in nature. Are there any legal obstacles?
Well, Senator, I'm not aware of legal obstacles. I do know, though, the first kind of analysis that would be done in that regard would be by the State Department. But I also know that the President has indicated that he would disfavor such a move.
But there are no legal obstacles.
I haven't personally done the analysis, but I'm not aware of them.
Let me ask you, we're all focused on kleptocapture. The real money is in the sovereign funds that have been frozen. But as to those funds, as well as the yachts and other assets that you have seized, do you need more authority to transfer the proceeds to the Ukrainian government so that it can use those monies to rebuild the country?
So the seizure of sovereign assets has now occurred in jurisdictions around the world, and we have come together, the United States, with the G7 to be very forceful, I think, in saying that those assets that are currently immobilized, both here and in multiple jurisdictions around the world, must be and remain immobilized. And we have a pledge amongst the G7 to do that. The question of how to then use those to the benefit of Ukraine and transfer them is, I think, a very complicated set of legal questions. But we certainly need to make sure, Senator, that as we come together and the G7 has been forceful on this as well, that Russia must be the ones to pay for the rebuilding. They must be accountable for the rebuilding of Ukraine. We have to act collectively and in a united way to put those assets to use, because frankly, if we don't act together as an international community on those assets, there will be seepage and there won't be as much force
to the extent the United States has immobilized or frozen those assets, we have them.
Yes.
We have a legal right to them.
Yes.
Under both international and our national law. Do you need more authority, the Department of Justice, to transfer assets that we control to the Ukrainians so they can be used for humanitarian purposes and possibly also military purposes?
We may well, and I'd like to come back to you on the domestic legal authority issue, which is, of course, what this body can provide. I think there are other very complicated issues of international law.
Well, international law has always been, in my view, complicated. Ever since I went to law school, I have never fully understood international law. It seems like a very kind of putty-like set of principles. But what I'm interested in doing is making sure that you have the authority to transfer to Ukraine real money, because we have a lot of real money in those sovereign funds that can be used by Ukraine to rebuild. And certainly everyone would agree with you that Russia ought to pay for the damage that it's done. I visited the mass grave sites in Bucha. I have been to Ukraine 3 times, twice with Senator Graham. The video that was played at the beginning of this session was graphic, but failed to do justice to the incredibly horrific crimes against humanity that have been committed. And I think we're all agreed that in principle those assets should be going to Ukraine to rebuild.
If I might, Mr. Chairman, just make one more response and put another plug in for authorities. I understand your point about our domestic law with respect to the sovereign assets. It is very important that we act as an international community because the vast majority of those sovereign assets are not within the United States. And so I think we want to proceed in a way that makes sure that we bring everyone together if we really want to have the impact, and I share your concern about having the impact that we want to have with those sovereign assets. Secondly, with respect to the klepto capture efforts, again, let me stress, we are leaving money on the table if we don't expand our ability to use the forfeited assets that we gain from enforcement of our export control violations and expanding the sanctions regimes that transfer authority is applicable to. So I urge the Congress to give us that additional authority so we can make the oligarchs pay for rebuilding Ukraine as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Like the other members of the committee, I think there's little doubt that war crimes have been committed by Russians in Ukraine. I have to say, though, I think there's an element of putting the cart before the horse here. Before there can be accountability for these crimes, there has to be victory in the war. And we're not on the verge of victory in the war because Joe Biden has been pussyfooting for the last year, not providing Ukraine with the weapons that they need to win this war. In fact, not providing the weapons they need to defend the territory where some of these crimes have been committed before Ukraine took that territory back. So rather than continuing to say that we're going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, we should be focused on helping them win as quick as we can. Now, Ms. Monaco, I know you're not in charge of the conduct of our policy of the war, but rather on the crimes itself. But I just want to make that point, that until the war is won, there's very unlikely to be accountability for these crimes. I want to turn my attention to something for which you do have responsibility, though. There's a statute, a criminal statute, Section 1512, entitled Tampering with a Witness, Victim, or Informant. Most of that statute focuses on the altering, destruction, or hiding of records to be used in official proceeding. Ms. Monaco, are you aware of this statute?
Yes.
Do you know when it was adopted?
It was adopted, if memory serves, after the financial collapse of Enron and other corporate malfeasance.
In 2002, after the Enron scandal and a law called the Corporate Fraud and Accountability Act of 2002. It also includes a catch-all phrase prohibiting not just the destruction, hiding of evidence, but also any acts that, quote, otherwise obstruct, influence, or impede an official proceeding. The department is currently using that catch-all provision to prosecute hundreds of Americans for their actions on January 6, 2021 on the grounds of the United States Capitol. I want to be clear, I'm not talking here about persons who committed violent acts against law enforcement officers or destroyed property. There's plenty of federal crimes that cover their actions, but rather this catch-all phrase for people who in some cases were merely present on the Capitol grounds, maybe not even aware that that had been cordoned off earlier in the day. Are you aware of a case called U.S. v. Fisher in the D.C. Circuit, Ms. Monaco?
I'm not specifically familiar with the facts of it, but I think it's one of the cases brought in relation to the events at the Capitol.
Yeah, it was decided a couple weeks. It was decided a couple weeks ago on a sharply divided panel in which the department almost lost, in which there was strong dispute on what that catch-all phrase meant about otherwise obstructing or influencing an official proceeding. And it allowed the case to go forward, but said that they have to prove corrupt intent. There's a strong dissent that said clearly the items in that law that precede the catch-all phrase, like destroying or concealing documents, should limit the meaning of otherwise obstructing or influencing a proceeding. I'm following the case closely. I wouldn't be surprised to see if the Supreme Court reverses it on review, or if the department can't prove the mental element of corrupt intent. Your Department of Justice argued, though, that corrupt, quote, encompasses all forms of obstructive and influencing behavior. That's a pretty sweeping interpretation of the law. Just this week, the House Judiciary Committee held a hearing in New York City, and it's been reported that a Democratic mob was in the hallway trying to get in through the doors and stop that hearing from proceeding. Has your department begun to investigate this effort to obstruct or influence the official proceeding of the House Judiciary Committee in New York City?
Senator, I'm not aware of those events, although I do know that hearing took place. I'm not going to comment on, as you rightly pointed out, that statute and those cases, and indeed the Fisher case is one that is moving through the courts. I'm not going to comment on the application of it to those particular facts or more broadly, precisely because those are cases that are moving through the courts and are important cases.
Well, there's no case in New York moving through it. I'm simply asking if the Southern District of New York has stood up a task force to investigate all these people who corruptly influenced and obstructed proceeding of the House Judiciary Committee.
The men and women of the Justice Department that have been pursuing and bringing the cases of the events that occurred in the Capitol have been doing incredible work. This is the most far-reaching,
I didn't ask about that task. I asked about a task force in New York. Let me ask you about another one. What about in Tennessee? A Democratic mob obstructed the Tennessee legislature recently to such a severe extent that the legislature expelled 2 of its members. Is the Department of Justice investigating all those protesters who disrupted the official proceeding of the Tennessee legislature?
I'm not aware of any such investigation, but I also wouldn't be able to comment on it if there was one.
But you see where I'm going with this. Like Senator Lee said, there also your department directed marshals not to arrest Democratic mobs outside the homes of conservative Supreme Court justices, specifically directed them not to conduct any arrests, even though they were clearly violating the black letter of the law. There's no dispute that they were clearly violating the black letter of the law. In case after case after case, the department enforces the law against its political opponents and does not enforce the law against favored political interest groups.
Respectfully, Senator, the Attorney General is very clear. He directed the Marshal Service.
The Attorney General very clearly lied in that committee, as Senator Britt demonstrated later by the slides that she produced.
Respectfully, Senator,
the marshals were directed not to arrest protesters outside of the homes. These were not criminal masterminds. They broadcast on social media when they were going to be violating the law, and there's not a single arrest, much less a prosecution. Meanwhile, you've stretched the meaning of a corporate document retention law to prosecute hundreds of people who were merely present on Capitol grounds on January 6, 2021.
Senator, would you like to respond?
I would like to respond, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. The Attorney General was forthright, was clear about the direction he gave to the U.S. Marshal Service. The Marshal Service Director was also clear that he has received that direction repeatedly. So I wanted to put that on the record. I also would like to point out that the men and women of the Justice Department who are investigating acts of violence, especially that occurred at the Capitol, are doing so sometimes at great personal sacrifice and peril to themselves, and I'm proud to serve with them.
Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because there are some concerns raised about the authority of the U.S. Marshal to do his job, I'd like to read into the record a statement from U.S. Marshal's Director Ron Davis regarding what he was told by Attorney General. Quote, he, the Attorney General, has also from the beginning made clear that we, the U.S. Marshals, have the full authority to enforce any federal statute, including 1507. I'm quoting the Director of the U.S. Marshal's Office. Thank you very much for coming to testify, Deputy Attorney General Monaco. My colleagues, human trafficking is an issue that should be of concern to all of us, and I'd like to ask you about it in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Since the invasion last year, over 8 million refugees have fled Ukraine. The vast majority of these refugees are women and children. Most have crossed the Ukrainian border without resources or a place to go. We know that traffickers target women, children, and those without resources. So Ukrainian refugees are extremely vulnerable to trafficking. Can you review for us the general tools the department uses to combat human trafficking and explain how those tools can be used to protect Ukrainian refugees?
Thank you, Senator Hirono. You're quite right. We have a number of statutes that are expert prosecutors and investigators who focus on human trafficking, and we have a dedicated group of prosecutors who focus on human trafficking crimes. And we have a set of statutes that they are putting to work every day, including on these issues that you so devastatingly recount. The trafficking and the forcible removal of children from Ukraine are amongst the crimes that we ourselves are investigating as part of the war crimes investigations and human trafficking investigations that we're doing. And it's also what we are working alongside our Ukrainian partners to help them build and collect the evidence, doing the painstaking work of gathering the forensic evidence and information to build these cases. This is not easy, as you might imagine. These are not territories that it's easy to get into, but we are working with our Ukrainian partners to build their capacity as well to collect the evidence to both build their cases as well as ours.
Do you have enough legal tools to pursue these prosecutions and investigations?
Well, particularly with respect to something like human trafficking or forced labor when it comes to children, this here again is an area that a crimes against humanity statute would be especially important to have. We cannot get at, as I mentioned before, the types of crimes, widespread, systematic crimes like forced labor of children, human trafficking and kidnapping of children in areas that aren't gripped by a wartime conflict, but are nonetheless visiting horrors upon children and vulnerable populations. We need a crimes against humanity statute to be able to prosecute those crimes.
Thank you. Russia has reportedly become the second largest miner of cryptocurrency in the world. We know that through techniques like chain hopping and tumbling, I know you know what those words mean, bad actors can launder cryptocurrency potentially to evade sanctions or move assets. Indeed, when the department announced the kleptocrats task force last year, its mission included, quote, targeting efforts to use cryptocurrency to evade U.S. sanctions, launder proceeds of foreign corruption, or evade U.S. responses to Russian military aggression, end quote. Can you give us an update on the efforts or the specifics, if the specifics would be too sensitive in this context? Can you give us an overview of the department's cryptocurrency successes and challenges generally?
Thanks, Senator. We have stood up something we're calling the National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team, precisely because we are seeing cryptocurrency being used in all manner of illicit ways, whether it's the facilitation of ransomware attacks and payments, whether it is the laundering of money when it comes to the oligarchs hiding their ill-gotten gains. And we, of course, see it in the terrorism context. So increasingly, malicious actors are using cryptocurrency to both facilitate and hide their criminal activities. So we set up a dedicated effort, the National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team, and they are working alongside the Task Force Kleptocapture to go after and literally use our old school methods of following the money and doing it in this new way. And one, I think, notable example of this is when, in the wake of the Colonial Pipeline attack, we were literally able to follow the ransomware payment because of, quite frankly, the cooperation of the victim company in that case, who courageously came forward and worked with us. We were able to follow the money and the cryptocurrency through the blockchain and seize it back for the benefit of the victim in that case. So we are doing more and more of that. And when it comes to the way illicit actors are using cryptocurrency, we are very much on our front feet to go after that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. Senator Cornyn.
Ms. Monaco, you've had a long and distinguished career in national security matters and at the Department of Justice more generally. I want to ask you about some of the authorities that are used to collect foreign intelligence, namely Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. As you know, that authority is scheduled to expire at the end of this year. And so we are undertaking some consideration of that reauthorization request and what changes, if any, are necessary to that in order to protect the privacy of American citizens who are not engaged in any sort of nefarious activity. General Nakasone, head of the National Security Agency, has called Section 702 irreplaceable, and he has said that without Section 702, we lose critical insights into the most significant threats to our nation. Can you tell us, for example, whether Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act has been productive in yielding valuable information related to the conflict in Ukraine?
Absolutely, Senator. First, let me agree wholeheartedly with General Nakasone. 702 is an absolutely indispensable national security tool. I have seen the value of it in every job that I have had, and you mentioned my prior roles in national security. I see it when I review the President's Daily Brief. A significant portion of that vital intelligence that we get is derived from 702. It gives us insights into cyber threats, helps us prevent ransomware attacks from foreign actors. But when it comes to this conflict and what Russia is doing in Ukraine, it has proved vitally important. Indeed, 702 has helped us uncover gruesome atrocities committed by Russia in Ukraine, including the murder of non-combatants, the forced relocation of children from Russian-occupied Ukraine to Russia, and the detention of refugees fleeing violence by Russian personnel. All of that we were able to see thanks to 702, and that information and other information has helped us as a country and as a national security community galvanize accountability efforts regarding Ukraine by allowing us to confidently and accurately speak with the international community about Russian atrocities. So, Senator, I think one of the most important things that this committee and this Congress can do to help us push back against Russian aggression is reauthorize 702.
Well, thank you. On a recent congressional delegation that I participated in when we traveled to Panama, Colombia, Argentina, and Brazil, we heard time and time again testimonials about how important that authority is for our government representatives in those places, monitoring the activities of Russian and Chinese intelligence officers and other activities. One question that came up is whether Executive Order 12333, which, as you know, is a broad, long-standing executive order authorizing a lot of our intelligence gathering capabilities, whether that is an adequate substitute. One of the things that occurred to me is that Section 702 is a law passed by Congress on a bipartisan basis and signed into law. The executive order obviously is a unilateral act by the Chief Executive of the United States. But is 12333, in your opinion, an adequate substitute?
I don't believe so, Senator, and I agree with the distinction you made. It is also, 702 is a authority that is overseen by all three branches of government. And I would also say that it has helped us really understand the strategic calculations of nations like Russia, like China, like Iran, and how they are approaching and evolving on major issues like the war in Ukraine. So again, it's an indispensable tool and one that I think is singular and irreplaceable.
My last question has to do with the Foreign Agents Registration Act. As you know, this is a long-standing law requirement that that agents of foreign governments have to register under the law because, frankly, Congress needs to know whether the lobbyist that's coming in to talk to them is advocating on behalf of American citizens or on behalf of foreign interests. So we're continuing to work on that. We're hopeful to be able to make some progress. But in the interim, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about TikTok, and one of the pieces of legislation that I've introduced called the Paid Off Act, which required TikTok to register as a foreign agent As you know, Russia Today, RT, and Sputnik have both registered as foreign agents, and appropriately so, since they're the arm of the Russian Federation, the Russian Communist Party. Do you think it would be appropriate for Congress to pass a law requiring TikTok, as a Chinese-owned company, to register as a foreign agent, particularly in light of the fact that this is a very convenient vehicle for the Chinese Communist Party to engage in disinformation campaigns in pursuit of their agenda?
Well, Senator, I'd want to look at the legislation you referenced. I apologize, I haven't reviewed it. I am very concerned about foreign sourced technology like TikTok, and I've spoken about this before, about the threat that it poses. And I will put in a plug here for other legislation that I have also become familiar with and that I have issued statements in support of, and that's the Restrict Act, which I think would give us a rules-based approach to address foreign-sourced technology like TikTok, like the next TikTok, like Huawei and the Kaspersky Labs, the increasing prevalence of foreign-sourced technology and the threats that they pose by doing business here and having millions and millions of users. We need the type of approach that is put forward in the Restrict Act to address those.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. Senator Welch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Attorney General, I want to ask a couple of questions about war crimes, in pursuing war criminals, and the role that the United States can play in that. Savage crimes, obviously, in Ukraine at some point, hopefully soon, but no one's optimistic that war will end. But the prosecution of those criminals must be continued. We've played an active role, our country, in pursuing war crimes and the people who have perpetrated them, even decades after the violence has ended. Can you tell us how the DOJ has worked with the international partners in the past to pursue those who are responsible for crimes against humanity?
Well, we have a long history, and unfortunately, history has required us, on some of the atrocities that have previously been committed, has required us to develop this expertise. And we have a group of prosecutors in the Justice Department, the Human Rights and Special Prosecutions Section, who gained notoriety and expertise by literally hunting down Nazi war criminals for decades, dozens of them, for decades and decades. And we have shown that our memory is very long, and we will go wherever it takes to amass the evidence and to find these perpetrators. Thankfully, because of the work this committee and this Congress did, we now have the ability to ensure, and the tools that we need to ensure, that war criminals, including those from the current atrocities being perpetrated in Ukraine, will not find safe haven here in the United States.
And you're talking now specifically as well about Russian nationals who are responsible for many of these war crimes.
Absolutely. So thanks to the work of this committee and this Congress that gave us what's called present in jurisdiction, a war criminal, likely after the conflict, cannot find safe haven here in the United States. A Russian war criminal will not be able to burrow in and find refuge here in the United States like some Nazi war criminals were able to do. So thanks to that authority, we will be able to bring those prosecutions, and we've got dedicated investigators and prosecutors who are more than up to the task.
Thank you. I want to ask you a little bit about sharing highly sensitive and classified information with allies. That was very, very helpful at the beginning of the Ukraine war, when in fact our intelligence showed that there was going to be an effort on the part of Russia to do false flag propaganda, and by sharing it, it really busted that open. I want to ask you just in general how you are working with the intelligence community in interagency partners to determine what information may be shared with coalition partners.
Well, Senator, as you point out, we really did in the intelligence community and our national security community really kind of changed its orientation in the lead up to the Russian aggression and continues to this day to be more transparent with our partners about what we're seeing. I mentioned to Senator Cornyn what we were able to glean from Section 702 collection about atrocities happening in Ukraine, and being able to then share that with our partners to galvanize them to come together with us. We have changed our orientation and being more transparent with our partners. The Justice Department, with the FBI being part of the intelligence community, are part of those discussions.
So you've always got to make a trade-off. What's the gain? What's the loss when it comes to some of the sensitive intelligence that you have to decide share or not share? Can you just give us some indication of how you go through that calculation?
Well, this is obviously not in my current hat. In my prior roles as the President's Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor, I would be part of those discussions, and I think you want to weigh the ability to bring our partners along, share information with them so that they can take action, and also make sure that we are not jeopardizing sources and methods that could prove more helpful in the long run.
Thank you very much. I'll yield back.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here with us today. I want to talk with you just a little bit. Just looking at Vladimir Putin, Ukraine, what is going on there, I think we all know that he is a thug and a war criminal. And you look at the atrocities that have been committed in Ukraine, and we also know that you've got other bad actors, China, North Korea, Iran, that are watching very closely. And when you see this, when you see the genocide that China's carrying out against the Uyghurs, what they've done to the Hong Kong freedom fighters in brutalizing them, their history and continued brutalization of the Mongolians and the Tibetans, and now you look at the bullying they're doing to Taiwan and to the island nations and the Philippines, and then what I would like to know is what your coordination is, what you're doing in conjunction with other agencies that are focused on these human rights abuses.
Well, Senator, I quite agree with you that China and Iran and other states, as I said to Senator Graham, I think are watching what Putin is doing in Ukraine, and that's why, of course, there must be accountability. When it comes to China and other states who are projecting power and perpetrating human rights abuses, as you laid out, we are using our authorities to hold them to account, whether it's malicious cyber actors, whether it's, and I would point to a case that we just announced earlier this week, where we've indicted dozens of Chinese nationals for brazenly perpetrating a campaign of intimidation by setting up police stations in downtown Manhattan.
Yes, we've talked a lot about that lately. Are you focused on the Wagner Group?
Yes,
and
Senator.
What they're doing?
Absolutely.
Okay, because you continue to hear about they're trying to branch out. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the abuse they're carrying out there, I think we want to know about that. Do you feel that the Biden family engagement with China has compromised the position that this administration is able to take against China to really hold them to account?
Senator, this administration, this Justice Department is giving no quarter to China's malicious activities. We have brought cases against malicious cyber activities, including members of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, perpetrating aggressive acts in the cyber realm, those who are perpetrating human rights abuses.
Let me ask you about Ukrainian children. I'm from Tennessee, and we have several churches in the Nashville area, my church being one of them, that have ministries in Ukraine. And I have a good friend who has a program for orphans there in Ukraine. And of course, we've heard just horrific stories about the Russians kidnapping children and taking them to re-education camps in Russia. Senator Peters and I introduced a resolution, actually reintroduced it, condemning this action. And I know that others are looking at this. So would you classify what they're doing to these children a war of genocide, the things that are being carried out against not only the Ukrainian people, but also specifically against the children? How do you classify that?
Senator, I think the Russians and the Russian war machine is perpetrating war crimes, crimes of aggression, crimes against humanity, specifically when it comes to children. Genocide, Senator, requires a specific intent. I'm going to be a little lawyerly with you. I'm sorry. But to
I think this is a pretty specific intent. When you look at what they are doing and you look at the human rights abuses, and I do think it needs our attention.
If I may, Senator, I quite agree with you. We should leave, and we will leave, nothing on the table. We've got a genocide statute. If we develop competent evidence to be able to pursue that, we certainly should do it.
Are you putting the same attention to the kids that are being trafficked at the southern border?
Senator, we are putting our resources also on human trafficking, as I talked with Senator Hirono about. Indeed, we established a task force specifically about the human trafficking and smuggling.
Well, my time has expired, and I have to tell you, people are getting so tired. They're exhausted, and just their hearts break for what they see on news reports and footage, whether it is coming at the southern border, whether it's what is happening in Ukraine, whether it's the stories about these re-education camps and the way these children are being treated. And the fact that it is just something up for discussion is really disappointing. We need action.
I agree, Senator. I hope you'll support our request for a Crimes Against Humanity statute, which would allow us to bring accountability for exactly the types of crimes you're talking about.
Senator Tillis? I'm sorry, Senator Padilla's returned. Senator Padilla? I'm not sorry you returned. I'm happy you returned.
You sure about that? Thank you, Mr. Chair. Deputy Attorney General Monaco, I want to join the chorus of my colleagues here thanking you for joining us today to discuss efforts to hold Russian war criminals and kleptocrats accountable during this unlawful invasion of Ukraine. I certainly appreciate your work and the work of the department and look forward to assisting in any way possible to ensure that Ukrainian victims of war receive the justice they deserve. Now, I understand the klepto capture task force was brought up earlier in the hearing. I understand that it's responsible for assisting the enforcement of sanctions, export restrictions, and economic countermeasures that the U.S. imposed in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In February, the task force unsealed 2 cases charging various crimes involving counterintelligence operations and violations of U.S. export laws. Can you describe how the creation of the task force has improved the administration's abilities to enforce sanctions against Russia and hold bad actors accountable?
Well, the task force klepto capture, first of all, I appreciate the kind words for the leadership of the Justice Department, but it's the men and women who are doing the investigating and the prosecuting who really deserve the kudos. They have been working flat out since the brutal invasion over a year ago. In fact, within 9 days of that invasion, we stood up task force klepto capture, bringing together expertise from across the department and indeed across the federal government, including the intelligence community. And this is something I've seen that I think is really a game changer. Now I get in my morning intelligence briefing information from the intelligence community about where some of these Russian oligarch assets are. And that information is fed to the task force so they're able to go after it. So it has really changed our orientation and how we're doing this type of work. They have been unrelenting. But again, I will say we're leaving some money on the table. We want to expand our ability to go after and seize and forfeit specifically the proceeds from export control violations, for instance, that could go to the benefit of the Ukrainian people.
Great. Now, in a hearing here last year, Director Adams spoke to the long-term goal of prosecuting those who provide aid to sanctioned entities like Russia seeking to evade accountability. Can you give us an overview of how the task force will carry out this effort and describe how the task force collaborates with foreign allies in reaching its goals?
Sure. So task force, first, as you point out, we've been going after the oligarchs and their assets, but importantly, we're also going after their enablers. The accountants, the vendors, the lawyers, the folks who are helping them hide, the oligarchs that is, helping the oligarchs hide their assets, under very Byzantine financial structures and to find any dark corner of the financial system. So for that, we need to work with our international allies. So we have joined forces with our European and other allies in something called the REPO task force. There's a lot that goes into the naming of these task forces. The Russian elites, proxies, and oligarchs task force, that brings together all of the work and the expertise from our international partners who are vital to us being able to seize those private jets that Senator Graham mentioned, to seize and forfeit those luxury properties that we're going after. In every one of these cases, we need and have gained vital international cooperation.
Okay. Is there any additional support you need from the committee or from Congress to address any issues you have with any data collection or enforcement?
Well, thank you for that offer to make my pitch again for ensuring that we expand our ability to forfeit. So right now, we are seizing assets of named oligarchs, and if they are pursuant to the particular executive order that this Congress passed an authority for us to forfeit those assets to the benefit of the Ukraine, that's terrific. But right now, the assets that we seize and forfeit as a result of, for instance, export control violations, we can't transfer those proceeds to the benefit of Ukraine, and we'd really appreciate the broadened authority for us to be able to, again, make these oligarchs pay for the rebuilding of Ukraine.
Great. And in my time remaining, just one last question. A recent ICC report found that Russia has committed war crimes and human rights violations, something that we've all recognized for some time now, including attacks on civilians and energy-related infrastructure, willful killings, unlawful confinement, torture, sexual violence, unlawful deportations of children. We've heard this from several members of the committee. Now, following the report, the ICC issued arrest warrants for the Russian president and the Russian Commissioner for Children's Rights for these abuses. Can you just spend a minute talking about the significance associated with this being the first time a global court has issued a warrant against a leader who's also a member of the UN Security Council?
Well, it's obviously a very significant step, and it's certainly one that is justified based on all of the recounting that you have done and other members of the committee have recounted the atrocities being perpetrated in Ukraine by Russia. So it is both justified and, I agree, a significant step.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Monaco, thank you for being here, and thank you for your responsiveness on a number of matters that my office have reached out to. I first want to start by thanking all the law enforcement officers in the DOJ. They're doing great work. The vast majority of them are fantastic. There may be a few that we need to hold accountable, but I'm wearing this shirt and this pin today to let them know that I back them. Quick questions. I wouldn't ask you to say this because you're more measured. You're an attorney. I'm a senator. Is it fair to say that if we go dark with Section 7 of FISA, 702, 703, 704 later this year, that Putin, Xi Jinping, North Korea, Iran are going to throw a party?
Yes, Senator, and on this matter, I will not be measured. It is an indispensable tool.
It'll be devastating to some of the most malign actors across the globe right now if we go dark. So that's why I want to talk about 702 and really follow on to some of what Senator Cornyn talked about. Can you explain for the committee and the public why the FBI conducts these searches? Why are you going into that data?
Absolutely, Senator. First of all, the FBI is the single agency that is actually responsible for doing something about foreign threats that reach American soil. So that's what people need to understand. They need to be able to act on the information that our intelligence community provides.
You all have implemented a lot of, I've got limited time and I'm not going to go to a 7-minute round. So Mr. Ossoff can speak. But can you provide just more detail about the change? I've seen the demonstration of some of the controls you have in place. I would take you to task if I thought we were surveilling American citizens. You don't want to do that. Can you talk a little bit about the safeguards that you've implemented and why you feel like it addresses the majority, if not all, of the concerns expressed by members of Congress?
Sure. Thank you, Senator, for taking the time to come down and see the changes that have been put in place. I would urge and invite
I would commend it to every member.
All members to come, and we'd be happy to facilitate that. The compliance issues that had surfaced with regard to 702 are ones that the Attorney General and I took, and the FBI Director took very, very seriously. So we put in place a number of remedial measures. First and foremost, making sure that analysts and agents can't just query as a matter of default the 702 collection.
I think thematically, because I do want to get to a couple of other questions, Ms. Monaco, I hate cutting people off, but I think thematically every member of Congress needs to go over there and see how the Department of Justice, the FBI, have been responsive to our concerns, that the checks in place are important. I did ask a question about the demo about what consequences are. With all those safeguards for a trained person to make a mistake, there needs to be accountability there. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, but we'll discuss that after this hearing. But I think it's critically important. I think you've been responsive, and I think our members need to look at what we lose. I think in response to one of Senator Welsh's questions, you made reference to some of the authorities under the Justice for Victims of War Crimes Act, basically being able to go after the bad actors, not provide safe haven in the United States. If I had time, I'd talk about if I were one of those people, if I were going to come to the United States, I'd pay $20,000, $30,000 to our cartel, get the camo outfit and the carpet booties that they put on their feet, and cross the Tucson sector, because that's a way to get to this country with very low likelihood that you're going to get caught, which is why border, it came up when Senator Blackburn was asking her question. We got to understand there is a way for them to get here, and we won't know who they are. So there is a nexus with border security. Has the Justice Department used the additional authority under the Victims of War Crimes Act to prosecute Russian criminals yet?
Not for war crimes yet, Senator, but we are working day and night to make sure that we hold Russian war criminals accountable, and we're building those cases.
I think for the purposes of following the implementation of that act, it would be helpful to inform us to the extent that you can on any prosecutions, particularly for Russian criminals that were enabled by any provisions that we have in that act. I think that'd be very helpful.
To do that. We have identified, I will say, a number of suspects in the investigations that we are pursuing.
And Mr. Chair, I have to ask this question. I'm willing to go back or stick for a second round if I must, just ask a final question. Okay. There are reports that the Department of Defense is blocking the sharing of information gathered by American intelligence agencies with the International Criminal Court, partly because they believe it could set a precedent that might pave the way to prosecute Americans. In your mind, is there a way to afford or a solution that could minimize the concerns raised by the DOD and the ICC to have this information that could be used to prosecute Russian war criminals?
I think there's a way to do this without creating any negative precedent, and the narrow authority that the Congress gave us, I think, provides that basis.
Okay, I've got follow-up questions on international tribunal, a number of other gears that I think we have to set in motion to make it very clear to Putin and any of his supporters that they're going to ultimately answer for their horrific actions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Tillis. Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Deputy Attorney General, nice to see you again. Thank you for your presence today. This was addressed in your opening remarks, and several other senators have raised it. But I just want to return to, in a litany of grievous crimes and instances of brutality and atrocities, one that I think is particularly despicable, which is the forcible removal of Ukrainian children from their families, their apparent relocation to Russia or Russia-controlled territory. And I'm sure that for everyone, and in particular for any parent in the room today, the theft of one's child by an invading foreign power is an unimaginable and horrific thing to contemplate. And there are thousands of Ukrainians, it appears, who are experiencing that. So what more can the department do to maximize the probability that there is personal accountability for anyone involved in the design or execution of that program?
So, Senator, it is unthinkable. It's almost unimaginable, but yet we know it's occurring. The forcible removal, the disappearing of children from Ukraine by Russian forces. We are doing everything we can within the tools that we have, the war crimes investigators that I've mentioned previously. But the single thing I think that this Congress could do to help us more would be to pass a Crimes Against Humanity statute. That would allow us to prosecute individual accountability for widespread, systematic acts of the type you're talking about that we currently can't bring prosecutions for. Widespread systematic attacks that are politically motivated against a population, a civilian population, in this case, children. We need the capability and the authority to bring those crimes against humanity, because that's what it is. It is a crime against humanity, the most atrocious and heinous type of crime that can be committed.
Well, I appreciate that response, and I know Chairman Durbin has particular interest in this matter, and Senator Blackburn and I, who jointly lead the Human Rights Subcommittee, have had discussions about how we can support efforts to strengthen relevant U.S. statutes to ensure accountability for those who engage in war crimes. And so we will likely be, as we collaborate with the chairman, seeking technical assistance from the department as well.
Be happy to provide that.
Thank you. What can you learn from the experience thus far operating in this environment that might assist the department in providing a similar service or embarking upon a similar project elsewhere in the world where on any given day, tragically, there are many places where people are being subjected to horrific crimes?
A few things, Senator. One, international unity and galvanized effort is indispensable to our ability to push back on the type of aggression and brutality that we're seeing from Russia. So that's true in our efforts to bring about accountability for war crimes, doing so hand in hand with our Ukrainian partners and our international partners. That's true when it comes to trying to disrupt the whole ecosystem that is fueling the Russian war machine. So going after and isolating them from the global financial system, going after the enablers who are feeding the Russian war machine, closing off access to technology, to financial resources that help them retool and rearm. All of that is what we are doing to push back against Russia, and that takes both an international effort and pooling all the expertise across our own government, and that's what we've been able to do, I think, quite effectively with things like Task Force Klepto Capture and the Repo Task Force.
Thank you for your answer. And building on Senator Tillis' question, do I understand there's an interagency conversation ongoing about implementation of the statute that authorizes some intelligence sharing for purposes of supporting potential ICC prosecutions. Do you have a timeline for when that deliberation may be concluded so we can move forward with implementation of the law?
I do not have a timeline, Senator.
But it's being worked through diligently?
It is, Senator.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Monaco, welcome.
Thank you.
You have a very important job. You're the number 2 person in the Department of Justice. Every U.S. attorney reports to you. The U.S. Marshals report to you. You are responsible for day-to-day operations of the Department of Justice, and in particular, the criminal justice aspects of the Department of Justice. Is all of that correct?
That's correct.
It is unfortunate, Ms. Monaco, that as you look back over the last 2.5 years, this Department of Justice, I believe, has been the most partisan Department of Justice we've ever seen. And that is directly contrary to the mission of DOJ. DOJ is meant to be nonpartisan. It is meant to enforce the law, regardless of party. I had hopes that Merrick Garland would actually do that when he was confirmed. Those hopes have been shattered. You have been a loyal deputy standing alongside that partisan corruption of Department of Justice. You have been willing to devote massive resources to targeting individuals that are perceived to be political opponents of the White House. And you have been willing to devote zero resources to protecting individuals who are perceived to be political opponents of the White House. I want to ask you about a statute you've been asked about already, 18 U.S.C. 1507. You're familiar with this statute?
Yes.
It's a criminal statute that says whoever with the intent of influencing any judge pickets or parades in or near a building or residences occupied or used by such judge shall be fined or imprisoned under this title or imprisoned not more than 1 year or both. Now, the entire country has seen hundreds of protesters outside the homes of Supreme Court justices night after night after night. You turn on your TV and you see violations of this criminal statute over and over and over again. How many prosecutions has DOJ brought under 18 U.S.C. Section 1507 under your leadership?
There have been no prosecutions under 1507. We're pursuing an attempted murder case against an individual who
Zero
threatened
is the answer.
Justice Kavanaugh.
I'm quite aware, and you're responsible for that, allowing these protests night after night after night. The violent threat of homicide of the individual who traveled across the country attempting to murder a Supreme Court justice, that was fueled by DOJ refusing to enforce this statute. Now, it's not an accident that DOJ refused to enforce this statute. The U.S. Marshals gave a presentation. The General Counsel's Office of the U.S. Marshals, if you look at one of the pages from that presentation, the General Counsel's Office stated the goals of the Residential and Personal Protection Mission: keep SCOTUS justices and their family free from physical harm, do not interfere with lawful First Amendment protected activity, avoid, unless absolutely necessary, criminal enforcement actions involving the protesters, particularly on public space, and making arrests and initiating prosecutions is not the goal of the Marshals' presence at SCOTUS residences. Are you familiar with this presentation?
I am. I'm familiar with the fact that the U.S. Marshal Service Director has been explicit, has been clear that the Attorney General has repeatedly directed him to enforce all federal laws, including 1507, and that his number one priority, and that of his many deputies assigned to a 24/7 security presence, is to protect the life, the safety, the property of the justices and
Did you
their
or anyone
family.
from the DAG's office meet with the U.S. Marshal Service and discuss Section 1507?
I regularly meet with the Director of the Marshal Service, the Attorney
and have you
General.
discussed 1507?
I discussed the Attorney General has been quite clear, and I have been quite clear with the Director of the Marshal Service.
Are you familiar with this presentation?
I've seen those slides, if they're the ones that Senator Britt presented to the Attorney General. But I want to be quite clear, Senator, about the direction given to the Marshal Service through the Director of the Marshal Service. He has been clear that the Attorney General directed him repeatedly to enforce all federal laws, to
With
make
respect,
his
Ms.
number
Monaco,
one priority.
that is demonstrably false, because this is written instruction. Making arrests and initiating prosecution is not the goal. That's not an instruction to enforce the law. That is exactly the opposite. It is 180 degrees. It is instructing them. It is not the goal to arrest anybody, despite the fact that the criminal statute said they shall be imprisoned. You made a political decision, Merrick Garland made a political decision, that because you agree with the protesters, you don't like the decision the Supreme Court justices made, the marshals were instructed, don't arrest anyone and don't enforce federal law. Isn't that correct?
That is not correct, because the Attorney General and I and the Marshal Service Director are so concerned about potential threats to the justices. The Attorney General directed in an unprecedented step, 24/7.
Not what this says in writing.
24/7.
What does this say in writing?
I don't have the right glasses on for that, but Senator, the Attorney General was very clear with the Director of the Marshal Service, and the Marshal Service Director has said the same thing.
The word not is
number,
even underlined.
The number one priority given to the Marshal Service for their unprecedented protection detail for the Supreme Court justices is to protect their life, their safety,
to ignore
and their property.
1507.
To protect their life, their
to
safety.
ignore federal criminal law.
Respectfully disagree with that characterization.
That's what the written instruction says. Not is underlined. Do not make arrests. Do not initiate prosecutions. Up is not down.
The Director of the Marshal Service has been very clear. The Attorney General directed him to enforce all federal laws, but that his number one priority is to ensure the safety.
Ms. Monaco,
and
what
the
you're
protection.
saying is objectively false.
Time of the senator has expired. There are no further members to ask in the 5-minute round, and we're going to conclude the hearing. I want to thank the Deputy Attorney General for being present. I would like to make a couple points as chair. First, the safety and security of all, including elected officials, is the highest priority. There is never an excuse for violence nor destruction of property in the pursuit of any perceived constitutional right. I think that it should be agreed on by everyone here. We have passed legislation in this committee specifically to protect federal judges and their families. The reason is there have been some horrible tragedies. One occurred in Chicago, another one occurred in New Jersey, and led us to put establish new standards in place for the protection of the men and women who serve in the judiciary. I might say that the one bill that we passed from the committee and sent to the floor, the Andorral Judicial Security and Privacy Act, was held up on the floor for almost a year by the junior senator from Kentucky. 1 year, when protection should have been issued, it was not because of one senator's decision. But finally, it was allowed to move forward, and it now is the law. And I'm sure, I hope I can say that we're doing everything we can to enforce it. Let me also say that it is interesting to listen to the debate about exercise of First Amendment rights. It appears that when the Department of Justice issued a memorandum relative to school board meetings and safety at those meetings, it became extremely controversial because some said it was in dampening or hindering parents to express themselves at school board meetings if they disagreed with school policy. I read it to protect the members of the school board who in my state and others have been threatened with their lives, intimidated to the point where they resigned from the school boards because of the coercion that was being extended toward them. Also, I can't understand this theory that what happened in the Capitol building on January 6th was so innocent. It was far from innocent. I believe some 800 have been prosecuted. Does the deputy know the number?
Over 1,000, Senator.
Over 1,000 have been prosecuted.
Charges brought, excuse me, Chairman, over 1,000 charges brought.
Over 1,000 charges brought. It is hard to imagine that anyone could keep a straight face and say they stepped in through a broken window for a sightseeing tour of the Capitol. That is incredible. What happened that day, 150 members of law enforcement were assaulted, some very seriously, suffering injuries they're still trying to recover from. And there was also the reality that a number of people died as a result of that insurrection. The fact that it happened January 6th was no coincidence. January 6, 2021, if I'm not mistaken, I know I'm not mistaken, was the day chosen when we counted electoral votes to establish who would be the president of the United States. There was an effort by those who denied the results of that election to question its results, and I can tell you that that was even witnessed yesterday by the compromise or settlement that resulted in Fox News paying close to $800 million as a fine to Dominion Corporation that manufactures election machinery, on the premise that there were misstatements made on the air about what happened that day. I hope that this has been brought to rest, this whole question of the legitimacy of the election in 2020, but it still is being played out. I'd like to say a word, if I can, about Section 702. Section 702 is a device or procedure used by our government to keep us safe. I believe that is the premise of it, to make sure that if we suspect that someone overseas wishes us ill or is going to do something in a negative way, we learn that ahead of time and stop it from happening. That is a noble and proper goal for it to pursue. The reality is, though, in the process of intercepting messages from foreigners, we often involve Americans in the same conversation, millions of them. And the question is, are those Americans losing their constitutional rights for due process by the 702 procedure? I have voted against 702 consistently in the past, but I've been assured there will be efforts made by this administration to put in safeguards so that innocent civilians will be protected from losing their constitutional rights in this process. I hope we can work together on that goal ultimately to be achieved. So there are many issues before us. I thank you for your patience.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, you have taken a second round of questioning.
No, it wasn't a second round of question. That was a chairman's statement.
Well, you also asked questions, and you offered a moment ago an opportunity for a second round. I would certainly appreciate that.
I did not offer for a second round.
Okay, so your rules are you get a second round of questioning and no one else does?
No, the rules are you don't make them up. I'm the chairman.
You make them up.
I appreciate the Deputy Attorney General appearing before the committee.
You're continuing your pattern, Mr. Chairman.
Well, you're continuing your deportment. I'd like to conclude today's hearing by sharing the words of a leader I deeply admire. I had a chance to meet with him last year. Sadly, I fear I may not have that privilege again. His name is Vladimir Kara-Murza, a fearless Russian dissident and a champion for democracy. On Monday, Mr. Kara-Murza was sentenced to 25 years in prison by Russia for speaking out against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Last week, the Washington Post published his final testimony in the sham trial. Mr. Kara-Murza said, and I quote, "I know that the day will come when the darkness over our country will dissipate, when a war will be called a war, and a usurper is a usurper, and when those who kindled and unleashed this war, rather than those who tried to stop it, will be recognized as criminals. This day will come as inevitably as spring follows even the coldest winter." Mr. Kara-Murza may not live to see justice for Russia's crimes against Ukraine, but he is absolutely right. That day will come. It's only a question of when. And we in the Senate have the power to ensure that that day comes sooner rather than later. The people of Ukraine are counting on us. Again, Deputy Attorney General, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.